My name is Iris Ashford, and I am 31 years old today. I work as a software engineer and run a small company that I started myself. I am the kind of person who likes to get to work early and stay until the sun goes down to make sure everything is done right. But my life did not always look this way, and the person I became was shaped by a single August afternoon when I was 9 years old and my parents drove away and left me standing on a wooden porch in eastern Oregon with nothing but a plastic suitcase and the sound of a windmill turning slowly in the heat. We had driven 6 hours from Portland in my father's old Buick. The air that day smelled like dry grass, and the metal fences along the road were hot to the touch. My sneakers were sticking to the seat, and nobody had spoken to me since we stopped for gas somewhere along the way. My mother, Diane, sat in the front seat flipping through a magazine like she was waiting for an appointment to be over. My father, Glenn, kept one hand on the steering wheel and tapped his fingers in a steady rhythm, the way a man does when he has already made up his mind about something and just wants to get it done. When we finally pulled into Ashford Stables, the tires kicked up a long trail of dust that hung in the still air behind us. My mother turned around and looked at me, but not really at me. She looked at my suitcase. She told me I would have my own room and that Grandpa had a big house. That was the whole explanation. That was all she offered a 9-year-old girl for why she was being left behind with a 70-year-old man she barely knew. My father carried my bag to the porch and set it down the way you set down a package from mail. No hug, no goodbye, nothing. My mother stayed in the car with the engine running. I looked back at her through the window, and I heard her say something to my father. She said that I was the one they could afford to lose. Then they drove away, and the dust rose up again, and I stood there watching until the road was empty, and the dust had settled back down, and there was nothing left of them at all. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the windmill to turn 100 times. Long enough to understand, even at 9, that something had been decided about me that I had no say in. The door opened behind me, and there was Henry Ashford. He was tall and lean with short white hair and plain work clothes. He didn't ask if I was sad. He didn't kneel down or open his arms. He just looked at me and asked if I could carry my own bag. I told him yes. He nodded and told me where my room was and said to meet him in his workshop when I was ready. No cookies, no warm welcome, just a direction and an expectation. I would come to understand much later that this was the most respectful thing he could have done. He treated me like someone capable, not like someone broken. His workshop was something else entirely. It smelled like old leather and machine oil and dry wood. Every tool had its place on the wall, and every surface was clean and organized. He started teaching me things immediately, before he even taught me how to cook eggs. He showed me how to use a wrench and how to tighten a bolt correctly, not too loose and not too tight. He said that if you go too far, you break the very thing you are trying to hold together. He was talking about more than metal, but he let me figure that out on my own time. That was his way. He said that working is how you stop feeling like you are drowning when everything around you is hard. He believed it completely, and he lived by it. And somewhere in those first weeks, I started to believe it too, because it was true. When my hands were busy and there was a problem in front of me to solve, the weight of what my parents had done got a little lighter. By the time I was 10, I was out helping him fix the fences. By 12, I could repair the water pumps on my own. He never talked about my parents. He didn't explain them or apologize for them or promise me that things would get better in some vague future way. He just taught me the next thing and then the next, and slowly, without either of us naming what was happening, he was building me into someone who could take care of herself. One evening, I noticed a ring on his finger. It was made of plain iron, nothing fancy. He told me it had belonged to his father. He said, "You don't just receive things because you want them. You earn the right to keep them." I thought about that for a long time without fully understanding it. I would understand it much later, in a room full of lawyers, when everything he had done for me finally became clear. What I didn't know at the time was that Grandpa was not simply an old rancher living quietly in eastern Oregon. He was an inventor. He had spent decades developing technology for farms and had done very well for himself, though you would never have guessed it from the way he lived. He drove an old truck. He wore plain clothes. He ate soup for dinner most nights. But the people in town knew who he was, not because of his money, but because of his character. He was steady and honest, and he helped people without making a show of it. He was worth well over $100 million, and he lived like a man who just wanted his tools to be in their right places and his fences to hold. We measured time on the ranch by the seasons, by what needed to be repaired, and what needed to be planted by the rhythms of the horses and the turning of the windmill. That windmill was a project he and I worked on together when I was about 13. We took it completely apart and put it back together from scratch. When it was done, it stopped making its old creaking sound and started making something smoother and more consistent, a sound he called the sound of something working the way it should. I thought about that phrase a lot. I wanted to be something that worked the way it should. While other kids my age were absorbed in their phones, I was learning to write computer code on an old laptop Grandpa had found somewhere. He would sit nearby and let me struggle with problems, and only step in when I had truly exhausted my own thinking. He taught me that frustration is not a sign that you should stop. It is a sign that you haven't yet found the right angle to look at the problem from. This turned out to be the most useful thing anyone has ever told me, and I use it almost every day. My parents call a few times a year, usually to ask Grandpa about his finances or his taxes. They rarely asked about me. When they did, it felt like a box being checked rather than real curiosity. On my 15th birthday, they promised to come visit. I cleaned the house. Grandpa bought a cake. I remember sitting at the kitchen table looking at it and feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in a while, which was hope. They didn't come. They left a message saying they were too busy. I took my piece of cake to the porch and sat there watching the sun go down over the hills while the windmill turned and turned. Grandpa came and stood beside me and didn't say a single word. Later that night, I heard him on the phone with them. His voice was low and controlled, but absolutely final. He told them never to make me a promise they had no intention of keeping. That was the most I ever heard him say on the subject of my parents in all the years I lived with him. When I graduated high school, I earned a scholarship to study engineering. He drove me to college in his old truck and walked through my dorm room to check that everything was safe and solid. When I hugged him goodbye, he went a little stiff because he wasn't a man who was used to it, but he let me hold on. I noticed a cough that I didn't like. He said it was just dust on the ranch. I told myself he was probably right. I didn't want to believe anything else. At college, I threw myself into the work with everything Grandpa had given me, the patience, the discipline, the ability to sit with a hard problem and turn it over until it gave way. I called him every week. As the years went on, his voice changed. It got thinner and more careful. When I came home for winter breaks, I could see that things around the ranch were slowing down. Tools left out of place. Fences he would have fixed immediately now waiting. He was 78 years old, and his body was running out of time. I stayed home one winter and fixed everything that had been left undone. I didn't ask for help because I had learned a long time ago that you handle what needs handling and you don't wait for someone else to show up. One evening, he told me that everything was taken care of. He mentioned a lawyer named Marion Voss and said he had made arrangements years ago and that all I needed to do was trust the paperwork. I didn't ask him to explain. He died on a quiet Tuesday in November. I found him in his chair, looking peaceful, the way a man looks when he has finished everything he set out to do. I took the iron ring from his finger and put it on my own hand. It was too large for my fingers, so I wore it on my thumb. It was engraved on the inside with 2 words, Ashford Keeps. It meant the family keeps its word, and it keeps the people who stay. My mother called within hours of finding out he was gone. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about the funeral. She asked about the money and the land, and she said we should sit down together as a family. It was the first time I could remember her using that word as though it meant something real. They arrived at the ranch in a car that cost more than Grandpa had spent on himself in the last decade. My mother, my father, and my older brother Brian walked around the property with the slow, appraising look of people calculating what things are worth. They brought their own lawyer. They had prepared arguments. They planned to claim that Grandpa had been confused in his final years, or that I had somehow manipulated him into cutting them out. They had underestimated him completely. Grandpa had prepared for all of it years in advance. He had been examined by doctors who documented in writing that his mind was entirely clear. He had signed his papers in front of multiple independent witnesses specifically to prove that no one had pressured him. He had been careful and deliberate in the way he was careful and deliberate about everything. The trust that Marion read aloud in that living room was airtight. He left the ranch, his inventions, his patents, and everything else to me. Over $100 million. To my parents, he left almost nothing, and in the document itself, he explained why in plain language. He wrote that they had abandoned their child and made no real effort to be a family, and therefore they had not earned the right to what he had built and what he had kept. My mother stood up. Her face had gone from the confident expression of someone expecting good news to something pale and disbelieving. She started to yell. She said that I had always been the one they could afford to lose. The room went very quiet when she said that. I think even she heard herself say it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just told her that Grandpa had already answered her in writing, and there was nothing left to discuss. They left, and they never came back. I stayed on the ranch. I kept the fences in good repair and the windmill turning with its steady, even sound. I finished building the software company I had started during my last year of college, and I ran it the way Grandpa had taught me to run everything, with patience, with precision, and with the understanding that you don't tighten a bolt so hard that you break what you're trying to hold. I also started something called Henry's Hope, a program for children who don't have someone at home to stay with them and teach them. We bring them to the ranch and teach them how to fix things, how to be patient with hard problems, how to build something that works the way it should. Grandpa didn't just leave me money. He left me a way of being in the world. He took a 9-year-old girl who had been told, without words and then eventually with them, that she was the one who could be lost, and he spent years showing her something different. He never said it directly. That wasn't his style. He just handed me a tool and pointed at something that needed fixing, and stood nearby while I figured it out. That was the inheritance that mattered. The ring on my thumb, the windmill turning in the Oregon wind, the knowledge that some people stay, and that stay in the end, is a thing that earns you everything worth having.